part 3 of the build series of the Eduard Zero and 1/48 scale. I'm going to be going over painting techniques. For the engine, I am using a dry brushing technique that has recently made its way, become a little more popularized by Darren Cook. What I've got is just some flat Tamiya paint here, and then I grabbed a makeup blush brush, I think is what it is. I don't know. Looked like it was perfect, and it looks like it was pretty cheap at the store, and it's doing the job pretty well. So what I'm applying is Spazstick's Chrome, mostly removed off the brush and just giving it a little bit of a dry brush. I think the effect works out really well. Next, I'm applying Fresh Engine Oil by MIG, just kind of as a regular wash over all the parts. Decided to go a little bit more basic with the engine build. The way the cowling is on this, everything is pretty well hidden, so I really didn't want to deal with adding any of the hoses or wiring or any of the other stuff with this. To prime the model, I'm using Mr. Surfacer 1500, and I have it thinned down at a very heavy ratio of probably about 60% thinner to the surface primer, and I'm using Mr. Leveling Thinner to accomplish that. I don't know the exact ratio that I'm using. All I know is that if I don't have enough thinner, then the surfacer can look really rough and gritty. But if I have too much, then it looks very much transparent. So somewhere in between the two. Sorry, this part can be a little bit boring. All we're doing is just applying a nice even coat of black paint. Not super interesting, so we're gonna just kind of skip through here. So for the next shade, I'm putting in just some white paint in random areas. This is kind of based off of the black basing technique. And so just putting in some squiggles in random places. Don't worry, it doesn't have to look pretty. You can have globs here and there. As long as it's technically smooth, then you'll be fine. So what this is going to do is this going to allow for some tonal variety to the paint coat that's going to go on top of this. The tan paint that we're going to put over this is going to be nearly transparent, and so a lot of the different shades that we're going to have below are going to poke through. What I'm doing here is I'm grabbing different portions of the aileron and just lining them up so they pop once we put on the next shade. For the sides of the fuselage, I'm just grabbing some white paint. I'm doing a few light stripes that are coming down the fuselage. I'm trying to replicate some different rain effects or just grime that was being affected by gravity and coming down. Also going to make some marks up at the top since it's going to be receiving more sunlight. As I go through, you're going to see that they're going to be a little bit more pronounced. The really thin, light, wispy stripes are not really going to do much when we're looking at the tone. Once the stripes are a little bit more pronounced, that's where they're going to poke through the next layer. For the bottom of the wings, what I want to do is kind of highlight certain panels, certain openings, and just certain sections, just so it gives it a little bit more variety, especially in an airplane like this where it's just one color throughout the entire bottom. It's going to give it a lot more character. Like I said before, it doesn't have to look pretty, it just has to give a lot of a variety and tries to lean a little bit more towards the random, but also purposeful. So now what I'm doing is I'm just grabbing a red-brown mix and I'm accentuating the panel lines. Now this could be technically part of pre-shading, and I know that can be a dirty word in our culture, but don't knock it until you've tried it. Now with any kind of technique, it can be overdone. So make sure that you're just hinting to the panel lines and not making it look like someone just took a mop over the panel lines. The good news is if you happen to overdo it during the pre-shading phase, this is actually something that you can actually fix later. You just want to make the different areas where you did the goof a little bit less transparent. Now for the red-brown mix of getting into some random squigglies here and there, just to break up the individual panels a little bit more. You can use kind of a stencil for doing some of this, but sometimes that looks a little bit too stark. I like this where it has a little bit more of a faded edge to it rather than a hard breakup on it. Speaking of hard breakups, I need to go make a phone call. Now for the sidewalls, I'm also going to be dragging and kind of giving you that stripey effect where the grunge is just kind of slowly built up and was dragged through gravity down the fuselage. Now for the bottom of the wings, it's going to get a similar treatment. I am going to pick out certain panels, but mainly I'm just trying to create some grunge that's kind of sticking into the different panel lines. Now to try out some different colors on top. So this is kind of a light blue, doesn't exactly do what I want. It's just a little bit darker, more blue than the white. So I'm gonna kick it up a notch and put in some more blue. Now this color, much better. Gives it quite a bit more of a shift, gives it a little more contrast compared to some of the other parts. And for this, I'm mainly sticking in between the panel lines and avoiding the actual panel lines. Alright, now we're getting somewhere. Starts to look kind of like marble, right? Hence the marbling effect. So now I'm adding a little bit more tone by having an even darker blue added to the mix. One of these days I'll get around to actually understanding what color theory is, but until that day I'm just going to fiddle around with the different colors until I get the result I like. Alright, now we're starting to get somewhere. There's a lot of points of interest for the eyes, a lot of different attention grabbers, definitely a lot of tonal variety and not just into single color paint scheme. Note how I've gone into some of the white panel lines and also added some colors in it so it has more definition inside of it as well. So now I'm trying red, and I'm glad that I only used it in certain points because man, it was just way too much of a shift on the other end of the spectrum. It shows through way too easily in the end, and so I'm glad that I only put in a few different parts because I had to then kind of put in too much paint over it to kind of cover up the drastic contrast. One thing I didn't notice until now is how close the paint actually came to sloshing out of the cup. I think we've all been in that situation. Not fun. I don't know about you, but one of my least favorite things to do in the hobby is paint matching. And when it comes down to what is the correct tan that is used on this Zero, there's all sorts of different forums online about it. If you want to get into the rabbit hole, I decided to elect the easy option and just go with AK's pre-mixed color. I figure it's close enough. When going through your mix, what you want to do is make sure that it is heavily thinned. Probably have close to about 70% thinner when it comes to the ratio on here, and what you can see is it's almost transparent. All that effect that we have on there is pretty stark. Don't worry, we're gonna add another layer on top of this to where there's just a hint of that effect. One thing that I like to do, and it's probably not necessary, is I try to just fill in each panel one at a time, like it's a separate canvas that I'm trying to paint. Whether that's 100% needed with this technique, probably not, but it definitely makes the process a lot more interesting. So at this point we can see the second layer going on. And we start to almost erase everything that we just did. And as long as you're patient and with thin layers, you're going to get the right effect. Because you don't want it to be too stark, but you also don't want to put on so much more onto your top coat that you basically just erased everything that we just did.
Bring the funk back.
So here is the result of the second coat. Looks pretty snazzy. You can see a little bit of variety in there, especially when we start to look in the different panels below. There's a lot of variety that's happening there. It looks pretty awesome, but we're gonna do even more. After here, we're gonna do a sort of post shading, just to kind of go over a few bits where I may have erased too much. And what I'm using is that same paint cup that I just previously had, but I am adding just a little bit, just a couple drops to brown is all it really takes. And we're just gonna highlight some of those panel lines, just enough to where it gives it a little bit of distinction. Alright, and just to kick it up a notch, what I'm going to use is a torn up Scotch pad, or you can use kind of the scrubbing portion of a sponge if you need, but it's going to create kind of just a random masking to just let a little bit of the paint through, and I'm using a lightened shade of the original color to just kind of poke through. What that's going to do is just kind of give you these little splotches where it's a little bit more sun faded. This effect works best on the top of the fuselage, where it tends to be pretty sun faded. Thanks for watching. See you on the next episode. Make sure you subscribe.